Julia Blocher is a researcher on climate change and migration linkages at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the president of the International Youth Federation, is kind enough to join me on the Climate Pod. Julia, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thanks so much for having me, Brock. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being on. You know, migration is one of those issues I think a lot of people understand is accelerators coming with climate change, right? This is obviously something that is accelerated by climate change. But we look at in 2021, what are some of the ways in which you are seeing migration impacted by climate change?
Well, I think that it's important to remember that climate change and weather impacts in general has always been a part of migration drivers. It's maybe more prevalent now as we see climate change impacts that we are living through today being more severe than what we may have experienced before. But especially for agricultural economies where your household resources and ability to feed your family at the end of the month really depends on weather changes, the influence of climate change on your migration patterns is much more present and prevalent today. So what we see really, though, is that climate change is modifying existing migration trends, and people are maybe migrating more frequently or to farther destinations than they previously were. We see less evidence of new migration flows, except, of course, in the case of natural hazard-induced disasters in which people are forced to flee suddenly for their lives. So I think even though we see in the media very often this climate migration nexus is described as something where people will leave en masse from areas around the world, the evidence does not support that. It's much more likely to be people who are living agricultural livelihoods, making a difficult decision to migrate for wage employment that they may not have made that decision otherwise, or perhaps moving more frequently when they would have been moving as in any case.
You said that climate change and migration are two development issues that should not be talked about without mentioning youth in the same breath. Why is that the case?
Absolutely. I believe that very strongly. Based on my empirical research, which I primarily conducted in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of the Pacific, I see that when it comes to migration that may be related to climate impacts or environmental changes, environmental degradation more broadly, it's very, very often people of a working age who are the members of the household that migrate to support their families and also improve their own lives. And very often these are men of working age, but women also make decisions to marry earlier and migrate in order to further their education in order to help their household that may be impacted by climate impacts. So it's important, in my view, to not consider all migrants and all migration outcomes and all migration patterns as the same. This would be inaccurate and reductive. We have to consider that migration is something that an individual person does, but as part of a wider array of strategies that the household decides on and supports and in a way invests in. So even if there's one or more migrant family members from a household, it's the whole of the household that is investing in that experience in order for everyone to better their lives and also improve their situation in their origin area. But this is very often young people who are migrating, and I think we shouldn't forget that because young people have different advantages and disadvantages as compared to their elders. They are generally of lower status in the household as well as in the destination area when they arrive. And this can impact them in a number of ways during their migration experience. First of all, we know that young women and girls are at a higher risk of gender-based violence. We know that very often young men in urban areas face heightened discrimination as migrants that they may not have faced if they were of higher status. And we know that also young people are more often exploited in underpaid or informal labor opportunities. So again, I think it's important that we don't conflate all migration as being all positive or all negative, but also really focus in on nuances so that we can have tailored policies that will help migrants and also help their communities of origin as well as communities of destination.
Well, and part of getting at the right policies, we have to have representation. So why is it so critical to have youth leaders involved when we're creating migration policy?
Well, of course, it's very important that when we're creating policies about people and their lives, that we should involve them at every step of the way and in a participatory and authentic and genuine way. And we see this across the climate change and migration question, especially, for example, when we're talking about small island states and how will we deal with people who may be more likely to have to migrate away from small island states. If you actually involve them in the discussions, you hear that they don't want to migrate, they'd rather find adaptation solutions in place. So the same goes for youth. If we're creating policies that primarily affect youth or predominantly affect youth, they need to be at the table. And not only that, I think when you bring youth to the table, they add a lot of value to the discussion. First of all, as we've seen, of course, in recent years with people like Greta Thunberg and the activists in the climate change space that have really captured the world's attention, they bring a lot of excitement and hope and also optimism for the future. So this is already a positive point. But then they also bring practical solutions and workable solutions that in a lot of cases are cost effective and scalable. So youth, for example, are leading NGOs to do migrant integration. They're working on new technologies that can help with biometric identification. They're working on technologies for communication so migrants can more easily find safe migration routes or places to stay in their destinations. The list really goes on.
With climate impacts and with drought, I know this is something that you study. We are seeing migration from rural areas to urban areas. This is certainly an inevitability as warming increases. How should we be preparing urban areas around the globe as a result?
That's a very difficult question, of course. But again, I would say migration from rural to urban areas is not a new phenomenon. I think what the challenge is to ensure that urban planning keeps pace with the migration that we are seeing. A lot of cities across the world are not necessarily prepared for the possibility of not only a much higher population than they have currently, but at the same time, the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing now, like increased flooding and damages to infrastructure. When we look at the risks of climate change, we sometimes use the equation of exposure versus the likelihood of impacts. The exposure part is usually looking at the current population and population growth and the vulnerabilities therein. And then the likelihood of impacts being, will we see that 100-year flood actually every 10 years now or every 5 years? Or so if we're looking to the future, we know that the population is growing in most places. And again, in some of the areas that are most affected by climate impacts, it's a very young population and seeing a youth bulge. So in the future, if you have a higher population, more people in informal settlements, more people in informal housing situations, plus a higher likelihood of climate impacts like flooding, sea level rise, flooding related landslides, then we really have potential problems in urban areas. And as I mentioned before, I have done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa and more recently in Tanzania, and Dar es Salaam and other cities in sub-Saharan Africa are among the most at risk for this type of impacts. And there are also areas where we have a lot of informal settlements in urban areas.
Looking into your research and watching some of the talks that you give, and as you mentioned in this conversation, when people move, how people move, and what conditions under which they move, all of those are critical. I'm curious, when we look at some of the people in the most vulnerable countries, what are some of the particular challenges they face when migration becomes the logical solution to adaptation?
Yes, many, many challenges, of course. I think the first one really is this facing the decision of moving in the first place, because in a number of contexts that I've had the opportunity to work in, like just as an example, Papua New Guinea, community cohesion is what people value almost above anything else. So the idea of having to move, or even having some community members having to move because of climate change impacts, is almost morally reprehensible or a kind of impossible solution for them. So that's the first thing, is really just coming to this decision of, is migration a palatable solution for us? And what we find in, what I found in some other contexts, again, like in Tanzania, is when the number of impacts becomes so frequent, so severe, you have drought repeating again and again over time, and over those repeated shocks, your household resources are eroded to the point that migration becomes an option. And then that's a difficult decision by itself, but then migrants then will very often face difficulty on route. It's a very expensive investment in migration very often, especially for people from very remote areas where paying for a bus fare and finding your way to an urban area is not as easy as it sounds. And then the difficulty of integrating into a destination where you find probably other migrants from your area to help you find a job and living situation. But all of this requires an enormous amount of strength, an enormous amount of entrepreneurial spirit. And that's actually, I think, one of the reasons why migrants are very often successful and contribute to the economies and societies where they arrive.
Yeah, absolutely. Nevertheless, it's still, as you mentioned, a really, really difficult decision, and it can be a dangerous one. And we've seen industrialized nations make promises, to provide funds for adaptation and mitigation, to provide funds for loss and damage, and overwhelmingly, they have really under-delivered on those promises. How might funds for something like adaptation or mitigation, or for loss and damage, help make migration better in countries that are the most vulnerable?
In a number of ways, and of course, we could go on talking about it, I think, for a while. I think the first thing to remember, perhaps, is that very often, especially European governments, have framed development cooperation and assistance as a way to reduce migration pressures so that people can choose to stay and contribute to their home communities. I think it's sometimes thought of as like a replacement for remittances. And a lot of the research that I've had the opportunity to be a part of shows that this is not necessarily the case. In fact, in some contexts, development assistance has actually helped more people make the decision to migrate because now they can afford it. So that being said, I think it's a positive outcome that you create the conditions in which people can either choose to migrate and do so in a way that increases their household resources and their own resilience and that of their families, and also provide them with opportunities for personal development, or develop in situ adaptation solutions like livelihoods opportunities that you may support through skills training, through alternative livelihoods, through helping develop local businesses and so on. And this is also positive for all the communities involved. So I very much think that adaptation financing is something that is still underdeveloped in the UNFCCC negotiations. And hopefully these discussions on loss and damage will push those forward a bit.
Yeah, this definitely seems like a big conference for that exact discussion. There's also going to be a lot of conversation about what we do in the climate sphere in a pandemic world, right? Since COP25, the pandemic has hit, and this is certainly something on everyone's mind as they go to Glasgow. How have you seen the pandemic affect migration?
Just in countless ways, and I think we're really still disentangling this, and probably will be for years to come. Of course, we know that with the pandemic, migration came to a standstill in some places, and even where I live in Germany, many of the embassies were closed for regular visas for a while, and so regular business travel was halted, just the same as the migrant laborers in India were striking because they were having difficulties getting home. And I think that, again, the youth issue is very important here, because even though everyone experienced a pandemic and many of us experienced it in different ways, we have an entire generation of people who really lost significant opportunities that would be difficult to evaluate. But we know for sure that a lot of women and girls dropped out of education because they simply couldn't afford it anymore, or in order to help their families in other ways. A lot of young people were unfortunately not able to continue their schooling because they lack the communications and internet infrastructure that would have been required. So I think what happened in the pandemic was to really disadvantage young people and also children, but especially young people who should be at a point of their lives of developing their next steps in their career. And I think what we'll see as a result is more and more people either migrating for wage labor that they may not have otherwise done so, or in some cases, perhaps on the other side of the same coin, some reverse migration. Again, in Tanzania, we noted a lot of people migrating out of cities during the pandemic because they felt that they would be safer in rural areas with their families. And at least in rural areas, you can find ways to subsist, whereas in urban areas, it was becoming difficult to do so during this pandemic.
Is that reverse migration expected to continue?
It's hard to say. This is something that we have noticed over a few years in some sub-Saharan African cities, that people may prefer not to reside in urban areas. So instead maintain their residence in a rural area and perhaps the rest of their household in that area, and migrate temporarily to urban areas for wage labor to support their residents in an urban area. This is something we see very often with Maasai pastoralists who I've had the opportunity to work with, that they'll take temporary employment in urban areas or in tourist destinations in order to have kind of fast cash that they can then use to invest in livestock back home.
So, obviously talking about the work that needs to be done on loss and damage, but when you look sort of big picture here, how would you assess how world leaders are doing when it comes to centering migration policy as a way of combating the climate crisis?
I'm quite optimistic on this point. I think that as compared to some years ago, there's really a high level of awareness and understanding among policymakers about the climate migration nexus. On the more negative side, I think there still really is a large disconnect between what we have seen in the research and what the evidence says and the type of policies that are being promoted by policymakers from a lot of different places. We still hear a lot of rhetoric about reducing migration pressures. Mm-hmm. And I think we unfortunately are still in this framing of rich countries versus poor countries, and how can we ensure that people don't migrate from poor countries to rich countries. And I think that that's, again, a reductive way to look at it, when we know that people who are migrating under the current migration pathways, and by the way, the only politically viable solution, I think, currently to increase those pathways would be using existing pathways and not a new status or a new category of migrant that would be like a climate migrant. The people using these pathways are usually the most educated and wealthiest people from their communities. So we are leaving out a huge section of the population, which are those groups that are most marginalized, like politically and ethnically marginalized people, and also members of the household who are literally left behind. And again, these would be women and girls and sometimes young people. So I think we're making a lot of progress. I mean, the amount of progress being made in the climate migration discussions over the past 10 years is actually really remarkable, and people should be proud of that. But there's more to be done to reduce inequalities, not just between rich and poor countries, but between communities in climate affected areas and even within households.
Well, and this is something you see with youth leaders. They're bringing in, they're sort of identifying and addressing how all of these issues intersect. What have you been impressed by listening to youth leaders talk about when they talk about the nexus between climate and migration?
A lot of youth leaders sort of inherently understand this topic because they know people who have been personally involved in migration because of climate impacts. So I think that what's interesting is that you see firsthand experiences being brought up, and I think this is something that is very important that youth leaders contribute to the conversation. Are those lived experiences and also the voices of people around them who've had these lived experiences. You know, not to forget that young people and these young generations are the most connected of any generation before. They're so connected on social media and other platforms that they are able to bring the voices and experiences of many people that they know to the table. And it's also, I think, important for world leaders to recognize that young people have different perspectives and viewpoints, that when they share their experiences, it helps us all, I think, to think a bit differently and look at things from a different angle, which is very positive when it comes to making policy solutions that can work for everyone.
Keeping in mind that the success failure framing of a given COP is inherently problematic, let's at least look at what you would like to see accomplished at COP26. When we get to the end of this 2 weeks of negotiations, what could be some of the positive outcomes that you might expect?
I have, again, a lot of reasons to be optimistic about this. And of course, I do think that we need to, as you said, not look at these conferences as being fully positive or fully negative. There's always going to be nuances when we talk about so many different negotiating positions. But I'm already very pleased to see that the youth COP that happened in Milan in September really influenced very strongly the chair's summary that was released before the COP began. You know, so the minister level meeting that was held in Milan, there was a lot of discussions amongst key nations that also involved the outcomes of the youth COP. So mentioned a lot of things about intergenerational equity and even points about loss and damage that young people had been discussing at the youth COP. So that being said, I think we need to see that being taken forward. We have a day on 8th of November, which will be focused on loss and damage, or at least a lot of discussions on loss and damage will happen. And I think it will be important to see this topic move forward, that we not only discuss reparations, if I can use that word, in a financial sense, but really also start to discuss more seriously, how do we address non-economic losses and damages, like the loss of cultural identity, cultural artifacts, and social cohesion. So this is something that I think a lot of countries bring to the table because it's so important for them. Like we hear the government of Fiji very often discussing the issue of social cohesion and cultural identity, but has not really yet, I think, entered the mainstream in Western and European discussions. So I hope that this Loss and Damage Day on 8th of November has some positive outcomes. And then we're also at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research and the International Youth Federation co-organizing a panel with the Platform on Disaster Displacement on the 11th of November, at which we'll discuss the impacts of climate change on migration trends and also specifically in my case on youth.
You're at the forefront of this research. When you look at years ahead, what are some of the critical questions that you want to examine in your research?
A lot, but maybe I'll just mention one thing that I think is really important and is beginning to enter the discussions now, is the issue of habitability and uninhabitability. So when we talk about, for example, these small island states or areas that are so severely affected by repeated drought, and we have to at some point consider, is there a point at which people consider that they can no longer make a viable livelihood in this place, and so make a decision to migrate, which I think we can consider more like forced decision. So we have a new project funded by the European Commission, which is called Habitable, in which we will look at this in 6 case study countries and try to understand, is there a point at which so many people have migrated out of a place, like let's say a rural village, that life becomes more difficult for the people remaining in that village, that they essentially have to leave as well. We did some work at the Potsdam Institute in India that suggested that this is perhaps the case in some contexts, that, for example, if most of the working age men have left a village, then there's so limited labor left over to actually complete the harvests or so on, or that services like schooling and other usually government provided services are no longer available to people. Then do they choose to migrate, or are they effectively trapped in these deteriorating conditions? So this is something that we want to look into, because it has implications for the longer term future. As climate impacts become more and more severe, will we see more and more areas becoming quote unquote uninhabitable?
Well, for people who want to follow your work, where can they find some more of your research online?
So I'm available on Twitter at Julia Blocher. I'm also on LinkedIn and academia.edu, where you can find my research. But I'm always happy to connect, and especially with young researchers who may be interested in the topic for their master's thesis or things like that. I have a few master's students myself and very much enjoy the opportunity to learn from them.
Well, Julia Blocher, thank you for forgiving my horrible American pronunciations. And thank you so much for your time and insight. And thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you again.